Sister bullied me for years but invited me to a dinner party. When I arrived, everyone had already finished eating and she ordered me to clean up and do the dishes because I was a pathetic waitress. My sister, Helen, has always been the golden child in our family, and my parents have never hidden this fact from anyone. As the youngest, she was deemed my parents' miracle child. My parents had tried for many years to have another child after me, despite facing significant health challenges. After my birth, my mother encountered complications that led doctors to advise against further pregnancies, essentially telling my parents to give up hope of expanding their family. However, 5 years later, my mother defied all the odds and became pregnant again. This news was nothing short of a miracle for my father, who was overjoyed at the prospect of welcoming another child. This miracle baby status has profoundly influenced my sister's upbringing and how my parents have treated her. They have always gone out of their way to ensure she had the best of everything, treating her like a queen. Every milestone and every achievement of hers was celebrated with great fanfare, reinforcing her special status within the family. This favoritism was never subtle, it was openly displayed and acknowledged, making it clear to everyone, including myself, that my sister held a unique and exalted position in our parents' hearts. Now, don't get me wrong, my parents provided for me as well, ensuring I had everything I needed. But the way they treated me often felt like an afterthought. Take school events, for instance. If both my sister and I had events on the same day, my parents would invariably choose to attend hers. They'd explain that she was the youngest and needed them more, as if my events and needs were somehow less important. There are countless childhood pictures of my sister, meticulously organized into albums that my parents cherish and hold on to until today. In contrast, they haven't even kept one album of me, claiming that my pictures were lost in a storm. I wish they could have at least saved a few pictures because I would have liked to see the way I grew up as a baby. It's hard not to feel like an afterthought when my childhood existence wasn't preserved the same way as my sister's. Growing up, whenever my sister, Helen, had a problem, it was immediately addressed and resolved, no matter how trivial. But if I ever complained or needed something, my dad would dismiss me and call me spoiled. If I ever felt anxious to try new things or talk to new people, my mother would tell me how overdramatic I was and would scold me to be more confident like my sister. My parents' attitude towards me always made me feel like my concerns and feelings were secondary compared to my sister's. And then there was the blame game. If my sister ever did something wrong, I was also held responsible for her actions. According to my parents, as the oldest child, I should have taught her to be better. It didn't matter if I had nothing to do with her actions. The responsibility always fell on me simply because of my birth order. This constant, unjustified blame further solidified my role as the less favored child, constantly living in the shadow of my sister's pedestal. Helen didn't help the situation either. She knew exactly how to leverage her favorite child status to her advantage, often using it to get away with things or to one-up me during even the smallest disagreements. She would frequently force me to let her use my belongings or wear my clothes without my permission. If I ever dared to protest, she would run to our parents and complain, painting me as selfish and inconsiderate. Inevitably, I would be scolded for not sharing and made to feel like the bad guy in every situation. However, Helen's behavior was decidedly one-sided. She never allowed me to touch her things, always being very territorial about her possessions. For a long time, we shared a room, and she fiercely guarded her side and her belongings. Even after we moved into separate rooms, the dynamic didn't change. She maintained strict boundaries about her stuff, yet always expected me to be accommodating and generous with mine. This double standard was exhausting and demoralizing. Helen's ability to manipulate situations in her favor, combined with my parents' unwavering support of her, always left me feeling isolated and constantly undervalued. It seemed like no matter what I did, I was always in the wrong, while Helen could do no wrong in their eyes. As a result of my sister's and my parents' actions, I fell into a deep depression. My self-confidence eroded, and I developed serious self-image issues as a teenager. The anxiety was overwhelming, especially whenever Helen would pick a fight with me or mock me. The constant fear of confrontation left me on edge, and my parents' aggressive yelling often pushed me to the brink of panic attacks. When they got too close during their tirades, I would feel like I couldn't breathe, as if I were suffocating under the weight of their disappointment and anger. No one in my family seemed to notice or care about my struggles. I felt like a caged animal, trapped in a cycle of emotional and psychological torment with no one to turn to for support. As a result, my only solace came from writing my thoughts down in a journal. Every night, I would pour my heart out onto those pages, detailing my fears, frustrations, and sadness. It was the one place where I could be completely honest about what I was going through. It was a way to process the chaos around me and to find a small measure of peace. I always kept the journal hidden under my bed, afraid that Helen might find it and mock me for my vulnerabilities. One day, my worst nightmare came true. Helen, who had a habit of snooping in my room, despite my repeated pleas for her to leave my space alone, found my journal while I was out. She must have read through its contents, violating the one sanctuary I had. When I came home that evening, I found my parents and Helen sitting in the living room, their faces unusually solemn. I thought maybe there had been a death in the family, seeing their serious expressions, and I asked them if everything was okay. My dad asked me to sit down so they could talk to me. My heart started racing as I complied, an ominous feeling settling in my gut. Then, my mother pulled my journal from behind her. My eyes widened in shock and disbelief as I demanded to know what she was doing with my journal. Helen just smirked, enjoying my distress, while my mother looked at me with an uncharacteristic seriousness and asked if what I had written truly reflected my innermost thoughts. At that moment, I felt so utterly exposed and betrayed. The journal had been my only safe place, the one spot where I could express my pain and frustration without fear of judgment or ridicule. Now, my most private thoughts were laid bare before the very people who had driven me to write them. The gravity of the situation overwhelmed me, and I could feel a panic attack looming as I struggled to respond. I quietly replied that yes, it did reflect my thoughts and that they had no right to go through it. My dad shook his head and told me that if what I had written was true, then they had serious concerns about me. Confused, I looked at them as he continued, saying that after reading my journal, they felt like I was a psychopath who needed help because of the hate they believed I harbored towards them. I was completely taken aback. Nowhere in my entire journal had I ever mentioned anything hateful about my parents or my sister. I had simply documented the experiences and feelings that their actions had caused me over the years. Yet, here they were, twisting my honest reflections into something sinister. My parents started blaming me for writing such dark things and even labeled me as a psychopath for maintaining a journal. My mother went on to tell me that she and my dad had never treated me this way and that I was making up things in my head to fill up this journal. She said that I needed serious help before I harmed someone. Helen even chimed in, saying that after reading my journal, she felt embarrassed to call me her sister because my behavior was clearly not normal. I tried to argue back, insisting that I had done nothing wrong and that I hadn't written anything bad about them. I explained that the journal was simply about my life and that they had no right to judge me based on my personal reflections. But my family didn't care about my explanations. They were fixated on their narrative that something was wrong with me. I felt so exposed and vulnerable in front of them at that moment. It was as if they had stripped away the last shred of my privacy and used it against me. My parents told me that they would be taking me to see a psychiatrist the very next day because I needed serious help before things turned south. Their words were laced with a mix of condescension and misplaced concern, making it clear that they saw me as the problem. I felt a crushing sense of betrayal and helplessness. It was as if they were determined to turn the situation around and make me the problem, rather than acknowledging the hurt and damage they had inflicted. The betrayal cut deep, and their response further alienated me and reinforced the sense of isolation and helplessness I had long felt. When I started going to a psychiatrist, I initially felt really uncomfortable and guilty, as if I had genuinely done something wrong. I had bought into the idea that I was the issue in my family, and I was embarrassed to share my feelings. My psychiatrist understood this hesitation and used my journal as a way to bridge the gap. She would read entries from it and ask me questions based on what I had written, which made me feel more comfortable and helped me open up. Expressing my thoughts had always been easier on paper than in real life, so the journal became a valuable tool in our sessions. Through it, she could see a clearer picture of what I was going through. As days and weeks passed, I grew more comfortable around her. I began to share more about my experiences and how I had been treated by my family all my life. Bit by bit, I told her about the favoritism, the constant blame, the emotional neglect, and the feelings of isolation and worthlessness that had plagued me for years. For the first time, I felt like someone was truly listening to me and validating my experiences. It was a slow and sometimes painful process, but gradually, I started to see that my feelings were justified and that I wasn't the problem my family had made me out to be. When my psychiatrist finally called my parents in for a session and told them how wrong it was to treat me as an inferior child, they were taken aback. Initially, they were very defensive, refusing to accept any responsibility for my feelings. They argued that they had worked hard to provide for me and that I should feel grateful instead of blaming them for everything. However, my psychiatrist didn't let them off easily. She pointed out that they were the ones who decided to have children and bring me into this world, so they couldn't use their provision as a justification for their emotional neglect and favoritism. Throughout the session, my psychiatrist detailed the numerous instances I had shared with her where my parents had wronged me. She talked about the favoritism, the blame, the emotional neglect, and the anxiety and depression I had suffered as a result. She methodically laid out the evidence from my childhood, showing them how their actions had deeply affected me. By the end of the session, my parents were silenced and looked embarrassed. They had never been confronted so directly with the consequences of their actions, and it was clear that they were taken aback by the realization of the harm they had caused. I thought that after the session there would be a positive change in my parents. However, on our drive back home, my dad informed me that they could no longer allow me to see the psychiatrist, claiming she was clearly biased towards me. My mother chimed in, agreeing with him, and added that since I blamed them for everything, there was no point in continuing with the sessions and wasting their money on something that wasn't helping me. I felt utterly defeated and sad. Despite everything that had been discussed, they were still trying to turn the blame back onto me. It was as if the session with the psychiatrist had never happened. They were completely unwilling to acknowledge their role in my suffering. Being a minor, I had no power to defy them at the time or to continue the therapy without their permission. Although the sense of helplessness was overwhelming, I felt somewhat better prepared to handle my emotions after all the sessions I had done with my psychiatrist. The therapy has given me tools to manage my feelings and a clearer perspective on my situation. I understood that the only person who could truly change my circumstances was me. I resolved to take control of my life. This meant dedicating myself to my studies with renewed determination. I began studying harder than ever before, aiming to improve my grades significantly. I saw getting into a good university as my way out of the stifling environment I was in. It became my primary goal in life. I also made a conscious effort to disengage from my family. Whenever I was around them, I would mentally shut off, trying to preserve my sanity by minimizing my emotional involvement. I stopped writing in my journal, recognizing that keeping my innermost thoughts on paper could lead to them being used against me. By focusing on my academic goals and setting clear boundaries with my family, I began to create a space where I could eventually break free and build a future that was not defined by their limitations and biases. In the end, when I went off to college with a full scholarship, one that my parents were against because it was too far away, I didn't care about their opinion. I was resolute and made sure to take all my important documents with me as I moved out. Although my parents didn't realize it at the time, that was the last time they saw me for a very long time. Despite their attempts to call or visit me at college, I kept my distance. I rarely interacted with them, never returning home during holidays. When they tried to guilt trip me, I would immediately disengage, refusing to let them manipulate me into feeling responsible or blame me for anything. I cut off all contact with my sister, effectively treating her as if she didn't exist. With the freedom and independence I had fought so hard to achieve, I focused on my future. I landed an amazing job after completing my degree and never looked back. For years, I continued to treat my parents with the same emotional distance and detachment they had shown me. However, everything changed when I was about to get married to the love of my life. My parents, having heard the news about my upcoming wedding from cousins and other relatives, reached out to me. They were clearly taken aback that they were not invited to such an important occasion in my life. Their call was a surprising one. They grudgingly apologized for everything, acknowledging their wrongdoings and expressing regret for their past behavior. They admitted that while they couldn't change the past, they wanted to create new memories with me. Given that I was about to start a family of my own, they implored me to forgive them and allow them to be a part of this new chapter in my life. Their apology was an unexpected development, and it forced me to confront a range of emotions. Since I was entering a new chapter in my life, I decided to let go of the grudge and invited my parents to my wedding. They also requested that my sister attend, but I firmly refused, and they didn't push the issue further. My parents had a wonderful time at the wedding, and looking back, I don't regret inviting them. They were genuinely happy for me and my husband, which made the decision feel right. Since then, I've made an effort to visit my parents' home from time to time for dinner, just to catch up. During these visits, I sometimes have to interact with my sister. She still tries to infuriate me with small, mean comments about my marriage or my family, but I make sure to address her behavior directly and put her back in her place. Helen's bitterness towards me has only intensified over time after she found out I have a better relationship with my in-laws than she has with her husband's family. Apparently, her in-laws still detest her and have never fully accepted her into their family. This is why she often makes subtle comments about my husband or my in-laws, trying to put them down. She uses these remarks as a way to express her frustration and dissatisfaction with her own circumstances. My dad has noticed this behavior on several occasions and has even asked her to stop, but Helen continues to make these hurtful comments regardless. 4 months ago, I found out that I was pregnant. My husband and I are absolutely overjoyed by the news. Given that he earns twice what I make, we decided together that it would be best for me to leave my job temporarily to focus on the pregnancy. This decision was supported wholeheartedly by my husband and my in-laws, who have been incredibly understanding and helpful throughout this process. When my sister found out that I had decided to leave my job to stay at home during my pregnancy, she was furious. Her anger stemmed from her own situation. Her husband never allowed her to be a stay-at-home parent because they relied on both of their incomes to make ends meet. Unlike me, Helen never had the chance to relax or take a break during her pregnancy. Hence, whenever we meet up, she voices her discontent towards me by criticizing my decision. She has called me foolish and has said it is humiliating to be a stay-at-home parent. Several times, I have simply laughed off her remarks and explained to her that I could return to work whenever I wanted, thanks to my years of experience. However, Helen has tried to twist the situation by insisting that my husband is being controlling, and that I should have never given up on my career. I find this ironic since it was my own choice to step away from work. I understand that her attempts to undermine my decision are clearly more about her own dissatisfaction in her life than any real critique of my choices. This is why I have tried to stay away from her as much as possible to maintain my own peace of mind and focus fully on enjoying my pregnancy. A week ago, my sister called me with an invitation to a dinner party she was hosting. She planned to have our entire family and her in-laws there, and she wanted both me and my husband to attend. Given that I hadn't been out much since my pregnancy, I saw this dinner party as a welcome distraction and a chance to socialize. I figured that with so many people around, my sister would likely focus less on me, which made me more inclined to attend. I agreed to go, but the evening didn't go as planned. My husband received some last-minute assignments that required him to work late into the evening. He was already stressed and kept apologizing profusely to me for not being able to leave his workplace on time. I understood that these things can happen, so I didn't hold it against him. When he finally came to pick me up, we were already quite late for the dinner party. Despite the delay, I decided not to cancel, believing it was better to go late than not at all. When we arrived at my sister's place, I quickly noticed that most of the guests had already finished their dinner and were engaged in casual conversation. Even my parents had left after dinner since my dad doesn't feel comfortable driving late at night. My sister immediately scolded us for being late, and while I didn't blame her for being frustrated, I stepped in to apologize on behalf of my husband, who was visibly embarrassed by the situation. She directed my husband to a seat and got him a plate of food, which was a relief, but then she pulled me aside and took me into the kitchen. There, she revealed that, since everyone had already had second or even third helpings, there was no food left for me. I was taken aback by this revelation, especially given that I was quite hungry and, being pregnant, felt even hungrier than usual. Despite my disappointment, I chose not to argue or complain about the situation. I understood that our lateness had caused this inconvenience, so I suggested to her that I could simply order something online. This way, I could still get something to eat without causing further disruption. She nodded and said she would order something for me, which was kind, but then she told me that since I had arrived so late and hadn't helped much during the evening, the least I could do now was clean up the dishes. I was taken aback by her request. I scoffed and told her that I hadn't expected to be asked to work for her simply because I was invited to the dinner party and happened to be late. I felt it was unreasonable to expect me to clean up her guests' plates just because of my tardiness. Her reaction was swift and angry. In a low, furious whisper, she retorted that as her sister, I should be helping her out, especially since she was the one who had done so much cooking the whole day. She pointed out my mother had even helped her out by serving the guests during dinner, so I should make myself helpful too since I was family. Helen emphasized that her husband never helped with the kitchen duties, so she needed my help. I argued back, pointing out that if Helen felt overwhelmed, she shouldn't have invited so many people. Her response was angry and dismissive. She told me I could never understand her situation and that the least I could do was keep my mouth shut and help her out. Then, in a cutting remark, she said that now that I was pregnant, I was nothing more than a pathetic waitress for my husband at home, so it wasn't a big deal if I helped her out too. Her harsh words took me by surprise and cut deep. I was already feeling hungry and emotionally vulnerable, and the weight of her comments made tears well up in my eyes. I didn't want to give Helen the satisfaction of seeing me upset, so I quickly ran into one of her bedrooms and shut the door behind me. I needed to find a space where I could collect myself. Once inside, I could feel my old panic attacks starting to resurface. The familiar sensation of not being able to breathe was overwhelming. I desperately hoped that my husband or anyone else wouldn't notice my distress or come after me. I needed this time alone to regain control over my emotions and find a sense of calm. After cooling down and reflecting on the situation, I was so enraged with Helen for her persistent comments and the way she kept treating me that I felt she needed to be taught a lesson once and for all. I decided to take action against her. I started by locating all the photos I had taken of my old journals. When I had moved out of my parents' place, I had taken my journal with me, and over the years, I had started to store images of the journal in my mail so I could never lose a record of it. This is how I was able to find photos of my old diary entries, which detailed all the humiliations and grievances I had endured at the hands of my sister years ago. That night, before my husband and I left, I made the decision to send all the photos to my brother-in-law as he was the only one that my sister was afraid of. I knew my parents would simply scold her for the way she behaved with me, but she would never ever change. I wanted to make Helen experience a fraction of the humiliation she justifiably deserved at the hands of her husband. I wrote a detailed message to him, explaining how Helen had been a significant bully in my life. In the message, I recounted how Helen had invited me to the dinner party only to make me clean up after her and the rest of the guests. I laid out how her resentment towards me seemed to stem because she was just jealous that I had a more considerate husband. My goal was to provide him with a clear picture of Helen's behavior and how it had affected me, hoping that this might lead to a better understanding or intervention from his side. As you can imagine, it led to a nasty fight between Bill and Helen. Bill could not believe that she had been bullying me constantly for years and had even told our parents that he now sees Helen in a different light. My mother completely blames me for their fight as she feels I crossed the line by exposing my sister, while my dad has chosen to be a bit more neutral. Ida for exposing my sister to her husband? Update 1. For everyone asking, my husband is equally enraged with my sister after hearing about what she said to me. During the party, he had no idea, but after I told him everything, he decided to call my sister to express his frustration and set her straight. I've never seen him this upset before, and I'm sure Helen must have been quite shaken by his reaction also. He has made it very clear to her that she should refrain from making any more comments about our family, especially given that she doesn't know the full story. Update 2. The reason my brother-in-law is so angry with Helen is because his own family has always perceived her as selfish and inconsiderate for all the years that they have been married. Helen has a pattern of blaming everyone but herself whenever there's a disagreement or conflict. For a long time, Bill has been giving her the benefit of the doubt since he loves her. However, when I shared my journal entries with him, it was truly eye-opening for him. Although he had always noticed that Helen and I were not very close, he had never been aware of our complicated history. Helen had conveniently never told him the truth. This lack of transparency meant that he had only seen a surface-level version of our relationship and was unaware of the depth of the issues that had existed between us. Hearing my side of the story finally filled in many gaps and significantly altered his understanding of my sister. It further proved how much his family was actually right about Helen. When Bill reached out to me this week, he told me all this. He also wanted to hear everything directly from my perspective. I was more than willing to talk, and we had an in-depth conversation over the phone. I recounted all the difficult experiences I endured as a child, emphasizing how my parents consistently favored my sister. I explained how my psychiatrist had tried to address these issues with my parents, but they never acknowledged their faults until I had almost cut them off after leaving for college. During our conversation, my brother-in-law also opened up about his own experiences with Helen. He shared how she sometimes treated him in a similar manner, but he had always attributed it to her being just herself. While he acknowledged his own flaws in their relationship, hearing how she had bullied me throughout the years and even as an adult was a revelation for him. It has really made him rethink their entire relationship. He is also afraid that Helen might be behaving this cruelly towards their child behind his back. Update 3. Clearing up some of your doubts here for the last time. First of all, my sister, naturally, held me responsible for everything and sent me several nasty messages after the party until my husband decided to intervene and shut her up. Since then, she hasn't reached out or said a word to me. Secondly, my mother has been insistent that I apologize and tell my Bill that I over-exaggerated the incidents from my childhood. I firmly refuse to do this, making it clear that if she continues to support my sister's stance, my husband and I will cut her off. My dad, however, understands why I acted as I did. Lastly, I don't know what decision Bill will take regarding his relationship with Helen. At the end of the day, my only goal was to expose my sister and make her see that she couldn't just keep getting away by putting me down. I don't regret what I have done at all. Now it is completely up to Bill to decide what's best for his future.